So you've purchased the Jump Scare Precon deck and you want to make it your own. In this video we'll go over the best new cards, the new commanders, the best reprints, and lastly, a selection of cards to swap in to begin the process of upgrading this deck. Jump Scare is a green and blue deck that utilizes the new Manifest Dread mechanic while gaining value from the extra land drops and intensive mana ramp. Our deck's lead commander is Duskmourn Mystery Unraveler, a 3/3 human wizard for 2, a green, and a blue. She has landfall, where whenever a land you control enters, manifest dread if this is the first time this ability is resolved this turn. Otherwise, you may turn a permanent you control face up. So before we go any further, let's quickly discuss what Manifest Dread is. This is a Duskmourn mechanic that is similar to Manifest and Morph in that we are utilizing face down cards. To manifest Dread, you look at the top 2 cards of your library. You choose one to put onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 colorless, typeless creature, and then the other one goes into the graveyard. If the card that was put onto the battlefield is a creature, you may turn it face up at any time you have priority for its mana cost. Like Manifest and Morph, flipping a face down creature face up does not use the stack and thus cannot be responded to. Now what's really interesting is this seems much more powerful than either of the older mechanics. Since you get to dig 2 cards deep, you get a lot better card selection than you would by simply picking a card from your hand to play face down. If you're at a game state where you want to get a card put into the graveyard for whatever reason, this can easily help you prepare for this. Creatures with abilities such as Morph and Disguise that have procedures on them to flip themselves face up can still utilize these procedures while they've been put into play by one of these Manifest Dread mechanics. I personally love the Morph family of abilities. It's such a sneaky way to play Magic, and if you're up against one of these kinds of decks, it can be pretty tricky to properly defend against it. You can swing out with a face down creature, and if the opponent doesn't choose to block it, you can just flip it face up before the combat resolves, and it becomes a much bigger problem for the opponent. Our deck's backup commander is Kiani Corrupted Memory, a 2/2 illusion for 4 mana. As long as Kiani's power is even, you may cast non-creature spells as though they had flash. As long as Kiani's power is odd, you may cast creature spells as though they had flash. Lastly, whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter onto Kiani. This commander seems complicated but fun. As you progress your board, your card draw will impact Kiani's power, and that math will influence what sort of cards you're able to give flash to. I feel like giving your non-creature spells flash is more powerful and would then incentivize you to maintain an even power on her during your opponent's turn so you can respond with more card types. Now let's take a look at some of the new cards seeing their first printing in this deck. I want to look at cards that either work well within the strategy this deck utilizes or cards that are generically powerful within the context of the commander format. Curator Beastie is a 6 mana 6/6 with reach. Colorless creatures you control enter with 2 additional +1/+1 counters on them. Whenever the Beastie enters or attacks, you manifest Dread. This card reminds me so strongly of the Titan cycle of creatures. Same mana value, same enter or attack trigger, and just a general value creature. Giving your colorless creatures 2 additional +1/+1 counters is a lot, considering every face down creature will now enter as a 4/4. These +1/+1 counters remain on those creatures once they flip face up, and so your face down cards can become even more of a threat. Lastly, getting 2 different ways to manifest Dread lets you really power through your deck to get out more cards. This comes down and immediately manifests Dread for you, and so getting 10 power for 6 mana is a pretty good buyback. Disorienting Choice is a 4 mana sorcery. For each opponent, you choose up to 1 target artifact or enchantment they control. Their controllers may choose to exile the card that you've targeted. Then, if 1 or more of the chosen permanents are still on the battlefield, you may search your library for that many land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped. This is such a strong removal piece. You get to target up to 1 card on each opponent's field, and if they choose to not exile it, you get any land from your library. This could either net you 0 lands, but you've then removed several problematic cards from the battlefield, or you can draw several lands, and while they do get to keep their cards, you draw into more gas. Kind of a win-win scenario. Giggling Skitter Spike is a 1/1 for 4 with Indestructible. Whenever it attacks, blocks, or becomes the target of a spell, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. You can also pay 5 mana to put 5 +1/+1 counters on it if it isn't monstrous, and then it becomes monstrous. This is like an aggro variant of Stuffy Doll. This is also a great target to manifest Dread. We have all sorts of ways of putting +1/+1 counters onto this card beyond its own ability, making it a larger, more big problem. Glitch Interpreter is a 3-mana human wizard. If it enters and you control no face-down permanents, return it to your hand and manifest Dread. Lastly, whenever one or more colorless creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. This is so strong in this deck, and I think it can even have external applications in non-morph decks. So starting off, you can drop this while you have no face downs to bounce itself and gain a face down card. So there is some tactical scenarios where you want it to actually bounce itself back. Secondly, that second triggered ability is just value, as your face down cards hitting your opponent will incentivize you to maybe keep some of them face down to draw cards. But you can also use colorless artifact creatures, colorless Eldrazi creatures, and creatures with the Devoid mechanic to get value out of this ability outside of the Morph family. You do also only draw 1 card per opponent hit, but that's still a good return on the investment. Zamone's Hypothesis is a 5-mana instant. You may put a +1/+1 counter onto a creature and then choose either odd or even. You return each creature with the power of the chosen quality to their owner's hand. 0 is considered an even number for this context. This is such a unique board wipe, and requires quite a bit of math and nuance to make the most of it. You have the option out the gate to put a +1/+1 counter onto a target creature to ensure that they are either hit by the bounce effect or protected from it. If your opponent has a board full of 1/1 creatures, but one 6/6 that you would like to get hit by this wipe, you can put a counter onto that 6/6 to make it a 7/7, which would then allow you to choose odd and clear all of them. Conversely, you could have a crucial creature that you want to protect that's a 2/2, but you want to choose even to hit your opponent's board, and so you can give your 2/2 a buff to make it a 3/3 so it dodges the effect. I genuinely love this card, and it might very well make it into many of my blue decks. So these were what I consider to be the best new cards from the deck, but we got dozens of reprints worth mention. Iesi, Tyrant of Gyre Strait, was a very expensive commander in its own right, being a powerful landfall deck in colors that can absolutely run wild with this ability. Ashaya, Soul of the Wild, is a very underrated combo piece and was the linchpin of my competitive Yeva deck. This card gives all of your non-token creatures the forest land type and allows them to tap for a green. There are a lot of broken combos that work off of this, but more importantly, this deck doesn't really utilize tokens extensively. It does make non-token creatures, however, in the form of those face-down 2/2 creatures. Turning them into mana dorks just gives them added value, especially should you have flubbed the Manifest Dread trigger and had to make a non-creature card into a 2/2. If it can't flip, might as well make the most of it, and now it's a mana dork. Hydra Omnivore is a powerhouse in this deck, and is a great target to have face down. You can turn this face up after the declare blocker step, and if this is gone unblocked, it will deal damage to each opponent. Considering how many cards in this deck also give additional +1/+1 counters or static buffs, this being a base power 8/8 can be backbreaking. Skewed Swarm is a super powerful creature, and it's a great landfall card. Getting a 1/1 insect creature token is already valued, but once you hit 6 or more lands, you start getting token copies of Skewed Swarm, meaning your tokens will begin to scale exponentially. There's a lot of math that goes into this deck, and so it's an absolute flavor win for making my brain do math. Trigon Predator is such a good artifact and enchantment removal piece. This is another card that's great to put in face down, so you can sneak in with it, only for it to turn it face up and blow up a critical artifact or enchantment. Azuri's Predation is more removal, giving you a 4/4 Phyrexian Beast to pair up with each opponent's creature, and then those creatures fight. Unless your opponent is also on some large creatures, this will likely clear the table of a lot of the creatures. Then, if any of those beast tokens survive, well, you get to keep them. Oversimplify is perhaps my favorite board wipe in this deck. You exile all creatures, and then each player makes a 0/0 fractal token with +1/+1 counters on them equal to the total power of the creatures they controlled that were exiled with this card. You basically take all of their creatures and consolidate them into one big fractal that has no other abilities. One large creature may be easier to deal with than many smaller ones, and so without any evasion, this can be easily dealt with. Scroll of Fate is another means to manifest cards from your hand. Manifest Dread only hits the top of your library, and so your cards in hand are preserved, but sometimes you want to get one of them into play face down, and so this is a great way to do so. Primordial Mist is an out to manifesting cards face down that you are otherwise unable to flip. You get to manifest the top card of your library each turn, but sometimes, either through this card's ability or otherwise, you'll hit something that you can't flip face up. This allows you to exile a face down permanent you control face up, and so you have an enchantment or artifact that you put face down, you can exile it and then cast it. Now, you've played with the deck for a bit and you want to improve the deck. I have 10 cards that I'd like to suggest adding into the deck to help hone the deck's main strategy and improve its consistency. For this set, I will impose a $25 budget for new cards. Brine Elemental is a very powerful way to shut off opponents during each of their next turns. Their skipping their untap step completely ruins their tempo for the turn and can help you get way ahead. Definitely one of the cards that you want to find a way to cheat the flip cost with though, as 7 mana to morph it is pretty steep. Growing Dread has Flash, and as it enters you manifest Dread. Lastly, and most important, whenever you turn a permanent face up, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. This is great to have in play early game, as everything you manifest Dread onto will grow larger as they flip. Paranormal Analyst is a unique way to keep cards out of the bin as you're manifesting Dread, allowing you to return a card from your graveyard that was put there through a manifest Dread trigger back to your hand. This is perhaps the most critical card to add into the deck, should you want to focus more on the Manifest Dread trigger further, as it turns the trigger into card draw as well. Threats Around Every Corner is another enchantment that enters in Manifest Dread. Whenever a face-down permanent you control enters, you search your library for a basic land card and then put it onto the battlefield tapped. This is a great way to convert your Manifest Dread into ramp, and it also synergizes pretty nicely with our commander Zimone. When you get your first land, you'll get the Manifest Dread off of Zimone's ability. Then you'll get a basic land into play tapped, which will trigger Zimone's ability again, letting you turn a card face up. It doesn't have to be the one that you've just played either. This can be a great way to cheat out bigger creatures without needing to expend any additional mana. Ixodron is an on-theme Wrath style creature. As it enters, it turns every other non-token creature face down. Ixodron's stats are each equal to the number of face down creatures on the battlefield. This does not give those turned creatures morph or any ability to flip face up inherently. However, our creatures may be able to flip up should they have an ability to do so, or we can use one of our abilities to flip them up. So we'll be able to recover for this much quicker than our opponents. Print Lifter Ooze is a card that I had so desperately wanted to use, and we finally have a means to do so. This 2/2 for 2 has Death Touch and can disguise for 3 and 1 green. Whenever it or another creature you control is turned face up, you create a 0/0 green ooze creature token with trample. That token also enters with X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of other creatures you control. This can get out of hand pretty quickly. You'll be getting more oozes to trample over creatures with, and as you continue to make more of these, they'll simply grow larger and larger. Simic Ascendancy is an add-in simply to take advantage of the +1/+1 counters that we are using pretty extensively in this deck, giving us an alternate win condition that can also put +1/+1 counters onto cards itself. Vanavar, Evolved Enigma, is a 3/4 for 4 with 2 modal abilities you can choose from at the beginning of combat on your turn. You can either cloak a card from your hand, which is basically an enhanced morph that has Ward 2, or you can put a +1/+1 counter onto each colorless creature you control. Remember, all of our face down cards are 2/2 creatures, and so giving them all more +1/+1 counters means they'll be much stronger when they inevitably flip face up. Hauntwood Shrieker has an attack trigger that manifests Dread. You can also pay 2 to reveal a face down permanent, and if that is a creature card, it can be turned face up. 2 mana to cheat morph costs is so good, and it makes it so much easier to get out cards like the Brine Elemental to trigger. This really feels like a tech that morph decks have wanted for years, but we finally get it in a super convenient package. Abhorrent Oculus is a 3 mana 5/5. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you must exile 6 cards from your graveyard. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, manifest Dread. This is a pretty simple card, but it has a lot of relevance to the deck. Firstly, the additional cost plays nicely into the Manifest Dread ability, forcing us to dump a bunch of cards into the bin. Then we get a Manifest Dread trigger on each opponent's turn, which will let us start our turn with some additional bodies on the battlefield and a few more bodies in the bin. Now, to make room for these 10 cards, we do have to remove 10 cards from this Precon list. Instead of simply making a one-time claim of the cards that I would cut, I will instead be posting a comment on this video with my choice of cuts. This way, should that list change over time through testing or preference or even new cards coming out to break older ones, I can update this list. I'll generally cut cards that don't work for my playstyle first, and then remove cards that are too costly to regularly see play, but this might be different from your methodology. But for now, we will wrap up our look at the Jump Scare Precon. I really like this deck. At its core, we're still on a landfall deck that's doing +1/+1 counter things, both of which are classic Simic tropes. But this deck brings back the morph mechanic family in such a way that makes this deck feel fun, fresh, and flavorful both to the plane and to Zamone's character. I also feel that we can upgrade this list and move it more into the realm of the morph mechanics without having to fall back on any of the older cards that might be a little more clunky on the morph ability. So thank you again for your time. If you enjoyed this video, likes and shares are always greatly appreciated. If you're new here, subscribe so that you never miss a new video. Once again, I thank you for your time. My name is Flynn, and I'll see you all next video.